Welcome to the Explainer. Okay, let's dive into this. Today, we're unpacking a concept that, honestly, most of us have heard of, but very few actually understand on a deeper neurological or sociological level. We are looking at the hidden science of reverse psychology. So, I want you to think about something for a second. Have you ever felt that sudden, almost overpowering urge to do the exact opposite of what someone tells you to do, just out of nowhere? Think about a toddler, right? They suddenly desperately want a cupcake the exact second they're told no. Or, as an adult, how about that sudden craving you get for a specific pair of sneakers only after you see they're completely sold out? It is literally the irresistible lure of the forbidden fruit. But why exactly does our brain do this?
Well, here's our agenda for today. First, we'll decode the actual academic reality of this concept. Then, we'll unpack the engine of reactance, see exactly who is most susceptible to it, explore its real-world use in therapy and sales, and finally, examine the ethical boundaries. Let's get into it.
Section 1. Decoding Strategic Self-Anti-Conformity.
All right, let's elevate what's usually just dismissed as a simple parenting trick into the formal, rigorously studied scientific concept that it actually is. In the scientific literature, reverse psychology is known by a much weightier term, strategic self-anti-conformity, or SSA. By definition, this is advocating for a position diametrically opposed to your true desire to trigger a predicted resistance in the target. And here's the kicker. This maneuver doesn't rely on logic at all. It fundamentally relies on the target's predictable drive to resist being controlled. The influencer fully expects you to push back, so they push you in the wrong direction, knowing you're gonna assert your autonomy by springing right back into the direction they actually wanted you to go in the first place. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how it maps out our social responses using the diamond model. Suddenly, the mechanics become super clear. Take a look at the bottom row. The influencer engages in self-anti-conformity, meaning they state a preference opposite to what they really want. But why? Look up at the middle row. They're aiming to spark anti-conformity in the target. They actually want you to deliberately move away from their stated position. Because if you just conform, like we see in the top row, well, the tactic completely backfires. The entire strategy completely rests on knowing you are going to be disagreeable.
Section 2. The engine of reactance. So, what exactly is happening in our minds to cause this intense pushback? To understand that, we've got to look at the mechanics of psychological reactance. This was first formalized by Jack W. Brem way back in 1966. Brem posited that we all have this sort of inner alarm system that goes off whenever our freedoms are threatened, creating an aversive state called reactance. But the magnitude of that pushback actually depends on 4 key principles. First up is perceived freedom, meaning you must actually believe you have a choice to begin with. Second is the importance of the freedom. You're going to fight a lot harder if someone dictates your career path versus, say, what you eat for lunch. Third is the number of freedoms threatened at once. Asking someone to completely stop drinking alcohol creates way more reactance than just asking them to moderate. And finally, implications for future constraints. If a student is told they can't eat in class, they might rebel way harder because they're terrified that tomorrow they'll be told they can't drink coffee or even use their laptop.
But there is a fascinating neurobiological element at play here too. Our brain's executive control network, or the ECN, basically manages our cognitive load and our sustained attention. Now, when you're mentally exhausted and your cognitive demand completely exceeds your neural resources, direct persuasion often just flat out fails. Your brain is literally too tired to process complex analytical arguments. And this creates a neural mismatch. Because your defenses are down, indirect tactics like reverse psychology can easily bypass your analytical scrutiny. They triggered an impulsive rebellion instead of a carefully reasoned choice.
Let's move to and see how this builds into Section 3. Who falls for it?
As the research clearly shows, not everyone is equally susceptible to these indirect tactics. In fact, our susceptibility changes dramatically across our lifespan. Notice that massive spike between ages 2 and 4. Toddlers are just starting to develop their sense of agency, and because they don't have the meta-awareness to spot manipulation yet, they fall for reverse prompts incredibly easily, like eagerly eating their vegetables just to prove they're grown up. Then, we see another massive peak in adolescence. Teenagers absolutely have the cognitive capacity to spot the trick, but their emotional drive to rebel and form their own identity, which is often called the Romeo and Juliet effect, is so strong that it completely overrides their logic. Now, in adulthood, it becomes much less about age and almost entirely about specific personality traits.
And that brings us right to the big 5 personality traits. Take a look at agreeableness.
Highly agreeable people are cooperative, they're pleasant, and they have a strongly negative correlation with reactance. Basically, if you try to use reverse psychology on them, they'll literally just comply with what you say. The tactic will totally fail. But look over at extroversion and neuroticism. Type A personalities, people who are high in anxiety, or folks with strong narcissistic traits are highly reactive. If you challenge the competence of someone with grandiose narcissism, their overwhelming, burning need to prove you wrong makes them an incredibly easy target for reverse tactics.
Culturally, there's also a stark divide here. In individualistic societies like the US or Austria, people are fiercely protective of their personal autonomy. They will react intensely to direct commands that restrict their individual freedom. Conversely, collectivist cultures like Vietnam or Saudi Arabia really prioritize group harmony. Now, they might not rebel over personal restrictions just to avoid social friction, but they experience something called high vicarious reactance. That means they will push back fiercely if they witness an in-group peer being treated unfairly or being actively controlled.
Section 4. Therapy, Sales, and Marketing.
So how exactly is all of this weaponized in commerce or utilized in clinical health? Well, marketers are absolute masters at creating artificial threats to our freedom. By telling you there are only a few items left, they are directly threatening your freedom to buy at your leisure. A famous example of this is Patagonia's Don't Buy This Jacket campaign. By subverting the traditional, direct sales pitch and literally telling the consumer not to buy the jacket, it created this memorable, highly enjoyable experience that, ironically, made the brand's product seem irresistibly valuable.
Now, in high-end sales, this takes the form of something called disqualifying the client. A salesperson might subtly suggest a customer can't really afford a premium vehicle, or maybe they aren't quite the right fit for an exclusive service. This directly triggers the buyer's ego. That deep-seated need to prove their financial or intellectual status completely takes over, and suddenly the customer insists on making an expensive purchase they probably wouldn't have made otherwise, purely to demonstrate their competence.
But, it's not just used to sell things, it is actually a profound clinical tool. Viktor Frankl, the renowned psychiatrist, developed a technique he called paradoxical intention. For patients suffering from severe insomnia, trying to force themselves to sleep creates this massive agonizing loop of performance anxiety. So Frankl would instruct his patients to intentionally try to stay awake for as long as possible. By demanding the exact opposite of the goal, he completely removed the anxiety of trying to sleep, which then allowed the natural physiological process of sleep to just naturally take over. Pretty brilliant, right?
And this brilliantly illustrates something quite surprising about our everyday lives. When researchers asked people about their own use of these tactics, a whopping 72% recalled using it for reassurance, compared to only 38% for persuasion. This means we are vastly more likely to use reverse psychology to fish for emotional support. It's like saying, "Oh, I'm probably going to fail this interview," fully expecting our partner to immediately jump in and tell us how brilliant and capable we actually are. We use it to fish for comfort far more often than we use it to become Machiavellian masterminds.
Section 5. Risks and Ethical Boundaries.
Because this is such a powerful psychological tool, it absolutely has a very real dark side. The biggest danger here is the catastrophic boomerang effect. I mean, what happens if the target is highly agreeable and just literally complies with your reverse suggestion? Well, you've just engineered your own failure. Furthermore, if a target detects that they are being manipulated, they are going to feel deeply insulted. They might even double down on their opposing view purely out of spite. Over time, consistently relying on these covert tactics creates a severe erosion of relational trust, basically fostering an environment where no one actually says what they mean.
When looking at the ethics of it all, the research draws a very strict line between constructive influence and manipulative control. Constructive influence, like we saw in Frankl's therapy, is entirely intended to serve the target's insights and growth. It's used temporarily and is almost always followed by transparent dialogue. Manipulative control, on the other hand, is entirely self-serving. It remains covert, aiming to engineer compliance by completely bypassing the target's reflective decision-making process. At the end of the day, the intent of the influencer makes all the difference in the world. So we'll end with this final, core ethical dilemma for you to consider the next time you're tempted to use this tactic. Are you using this psychological mechanism to foster someone's true independence, or are you simply engineering their compliance for your own benefit? It is a very fine line between a clever nudge and covert manipulation. Think about that the next time you find yourself wanting the forbidden fruit. Thanks for joining me for this explainer, and keep questioning the why behind your choices.